nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Idam Shri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripakrite Ya Sri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Guti Matsarvasa Parambojo Radha Madanamohano Adadanastrinam Dantoyer Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhuli Syam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Valashvavara Sri Rupa Chinta Malasapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Hai Churastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasada Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Nirupadi Atupada Padme Ya Bhakti Nikilarta Varga Janani Ya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Param Bhujayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Kuryat Brajaloka Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Ya Ramya Nikilagha Sangha Shamani Shrotra Tritim Sangata Ya Svadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Ya Dhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Charjas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali. And in particular, we're in this section on Sotsukya Prarthana, or prayers full of eagerness. And in the concluding portion of this discussion, Sri Rupa Pad cites the 6th and then the 4th verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam. So in our last couple of discussions, we've gone over aspects of the 6th verse of the Shikshastakam. So today we'll conclude that, and we may begin discussion of the 4th verse of the Shikshastakam, the final verse of this prakaran on prayers full of eagerness, or Sotsukya Prarthana. So specifically, in our last discussion, we looked at Kaviraj Goswami's rendering of the purport of this 6th verse by saying that without the wealth of prema, life is vain and poor. Prema dhan vina vyartra daridra jivan das kori vetana more deho prema dhan. So we'll look at a couple of other similar points places elsewhere in the Charitamrita where this same principle or this same point is also discussed. And that will give us further insight into the intent in Mahaprabhu's prayer here. So, Sri Kaviraj Goswami Pad thus portrays Sriman Mahaprabhu's prayer in the verse under discussion as rising from a feeling of poverty and unsuccessfulness. That is, the humility that emerges from the desire for prema, that emerges from grasp of it being the ultimate aim, which arises from a clear understanding of why it is supremely valuable. So as we concluded last time, it is from knowledge that there will come conviction and faith and clarity of understanding, and from that will come an intensity of desire. From that intensity of desire will come a feeling of absence and want, and from that feeling of absence and want will come a feeling of humility, and that feeling of humility will leave one feeling as though one's life is vain and poor without the wealth of prem. So, furthermore, in his synoptic portrayal of the bhava in which Sriman Mahaprabhu absorbed himself during his final 12 years, while living in seclusion and associating almost exclusively with only his most intimate companions, Sri Sarup Damodar and Sri Ramananda Rai, Sri Kaviraj Goswami Pad demonstrates that the humility and longing in the heart of Sriman Mahaprabhu, which have given rise to the verse under discussion, were such prominent features of Sriman Mahaprabhu's bhav that he would often lament as follows. So, quote, Shunamor pranera bhanda, nahi Krishna premadhan, daridramor jivan, dehindriya vritta morasav. Listen, my dear friends of the heart, I do not have the wealth of Krishna prema. I have a poor life. My body and senses all remain only in vain. So what's noteworthy here is that this very same phrase, which Kaviraj Goswami gives to render the 6th verse of the Shikshastakam, he expresses the very same point when he's summarizing or encapsulating Mahaprabhu's bhav during his Antya-lila, when he gives an overview of this in the 2nd chapter of the Madhya-lila. So what this indicates for us is that this spirit of sotsukya prarthana, or praying out of eagerness, out of this feeling of being unable to pass the time because of these intense feelings of want, that this was central to, or this was a primary feature of this bhav that Mahaprabhu elected to spend the later portion of his life focused on in seclusion in the company of his pranabandhavas, his the dear friends of his heart, or those with whom he could bear the fullness of his inner landscape, if you will. So, if we unpack the metaphor that's described here, we can get the following understanding. Sriman Mahaprabhu's intent in this lament can be understood as follows. A poor man whose storeroom is devoid of wealth cannot nourish and support his own body or family. Moreover, he feels them to be a burden he cannot bear, and his life to be worrisome, afflictive, and difficult to tolerate. So when someone is poor, they can't take care of their own body, they can't take care of their families, they feel a lot of worries, they struggle with various afflictions, they find that just to live, just to survive is something that requires tolerance to sustain. Similarly, I, whose heart is devoid of prema, am poor and cannot nourish and support my body and senses. I cannot supply them with eligibility and opportunity to render personal service to Sri Krishna, which is their only real purpose and fulfillment. Since it is only prema that leads to one receiving from Sri Krishna such eligibility and opportunity, and I am devoid of that prema. So the whole dynamic here is that prema is being equated with wealth. So therefore the afflictions that befall someone who lacks wealth, Mahaprabhu feels himself to be afflicted with comparable affliction because of his lack of prema. So he feels that the purpose of his body, the purpose of his senses, is to serve Krishna. Just as a Vishai feels that the purpose of their existence is to enjoy Vishai, or objects of the senses. So when the Vishai can't have his Vishai, he feels difficulty, he feels, out like uncomfortable or devoid of what sustains him. So when this Mahaprabhu and this Bhakta Bhav feels that his very purpose of his life, the central feature of his psychological attunement is to serve Krishna, and yet he can't see Krishna, he can't serve Krishna, then he feels like his body, his senses, all of his sensory perceptions are all empty, they're all vain, and not only that, but they're a disturbance, or they're drawing him away from what he cherishes. And just as you can only, get that sense of peace and prosperity and so on when you have money, and therefore the means to acquire the objects that give you comfort and pleasure and so on, then he feels the only way I would ever get the chance to serve Krishna is with prema, but I don't have prema. So I'm like a person who has no wealth. I don't have that prema, which is the means to getting that very thing that I live for, that very thing I can't live without. So I thus feel my body and senses to be a burden that is worrisome, afflictive, and difficult to tolerate. Moreover, just as a poor man and his family live only on meager and malnourishing food, that they otherwise would never eat and feel miserable, so my body and senses remain absorbed only in meager and malnourishing worldly objects, or vishai, and consequently undergo misery. In this way, my body and senses remain only in vain, misused, devoid of fulfillment, and troubled. So, this humility, this longing, this eagerness that is felt by a bhakta renders all of the pleasures of the world into displeasures, or it inhibits the pleasures of the world from being pleasurable. So, are you sure you want that? to exist in a state where you don't have the spiritual object that you're seeking, nor can you enjoy the material objects that you used to. So you're neither here nor there. You're in a state of desperation. So this is not an easy thing to undergo. This is not an easy thing to experience. It's something turbulent. It's something disquieting. It's something unsettling. And yet we're told that this is integral to the experience of prema. This is the primary means of experiencing prema. So prema is something by constitution, something that's very intense, something that's can be, rattling or shaking, or, leaving one without a sense of steadiness. So those whose hearts are ready for that type of, journey, just as if you set sail on the ocean. If you've ever actually been on a ship at sea, you know that the sea is a very bumpy place. Constantly, waves going up and down and winds and all sorts of things. So similarly, to set sail into this path of bhakti, or this journey of prema, is something that leaves one in a perpetual state of flux. So those who undergo it, they experience both the greatest joys and the greatest sorrows, as it's given also in this summary of the Antya-lila, this other beautiful verse of Rupa Gosvami Pad, where he describes prema as being similar to drinking the most wonderful nectar and the most deadly poison at the same time. And Sanatana Pad also, in his depiction of the people of Braj, and in his description of Gopakumar's final state of this type of want and humility before he finally enters Braj, he feels himself as though utterly unable to decide whether all that he's gone through on his entire journey up through all of these lokas into Dwaraka and so on, whether this thing that he's ultimately seeking is actually a blessing or a curse, is actually nectarian or poisonous. The jury is still out on this. It's that, Vishamrita ekatra milan, as it's told elsewhere here in the Charitamrita. It's like an extraordinary combination of the two. So these are the sort of, you could say, the mist coming from the sea of this experience is described like that, if you will. So, by saying that all my senses remain in vain, my life is poor, I lack this wealth of prem, then Mahaprabhu is expressing this sense of humility, and this gives us an understanding of why he compares prema to wealth. So, as from a conventional worldly perspective, a person is regarded as successful when they acquire a great, rarely attainable mass of wealth, and thereby the finest objects of enjoyment. So, a bhakta is successful when they acquire the supreme wealth of Krishna Prem, and thereby the supreme object. He who is the cause of the supreme spiritual bliss, and the ultimate source, support, possessor, animator, sustainer, and fulfiller of the totality of infinite existence, replete with infinite inconceivable magnificence and sweetness, Bhagavan, Sri Krishna, and can thus render service to him and experience the superlative bliss of relishing the finest features of his essential nature. So just as you can only eat the finest food and fly on the finest private jets and use the finest gadgets and apply the finest cosmetics and all of this when you're really, really rich, then similarly, you can only relish the finest features of Krishna's essential nature. You can only relish the fine madhuryas of Braja when you have this most rare and valuable form of prem, Braja Prem, or the prem that manifests from Braja Bhav. For such a bhakta, life's success lies only in that. And thus when a bhakta feels themselves to be devoid of that, they feel they have only a vain and poor life. Means monetarily they may be poor, they may be rich, they may be in the middle. In other words, regardless of their worldly circumstances, monetarily or whatever the case, or all other, features on the rubric, when they become one-pointed or akantik in this way, this is what determines, quote unquote, how they are, or how are you? This is how I am. I'm living a life like this in want of that. And that want is so intense that concern for all else is eclipsed, such that it's rendered into the sphere of insignificance. Consequently, just as a poor person searches for employment, and upon finding a potential employer, requests to be employed at a job and paid a salary of a particular measure, so Sriman Mahaprabhu is accordingly envisioned here to pray to Sri Krishna, the ultimate source, bestower, and object of prema, to be engaged as a servant and remunerated for his service with a salary of prema. Quote, Das Hori Betana More Deho Prema Dan. Please make me your servant and grant me a salary of the wealth of prem. So it may appear a little bit odd that Mahaprabhu is saying, please give me a salary of prem, or pay me for my service, if the whole premise of Uttama Bhakti and Prema Bhakti and Gopi Bhav is this idea that one isn't seeking some separate result from one's bhakti, apart from the pleasure of Krishna's pleasure, or of taking pleasure in Krishna's pleasure, so to speak, then why would one pray for remuneration, or why would one pray for some salary for one's service? Isn't service, after all, something done as a gift, not as a job that you expect? So then we have to understand that the intent in this context is integral to the metaphor. In other words, because Mahaprabhu has compared prema to wealth, therefore he's asking for a salary. In other words, it's just a metaphoric way of saying he wants prem, not that he wants any separate remuneration, or he's engaging in a merely transactional if-then contract, so to speak. But rather all he's simply saying is that I pray to be given prem, and I pray to, with that prem, be able to serve you. But to flush out the metaphor, it's couched in this way. So when a person has no money, then they look for a job and they want to get paid money in return. So Mahaprabhu is similarly saying, I'm ready to do whatever is required, but what I hanker for is prema for you. And provided I'm provided with that, I'm ready to please you howsoever you wish. So when a person has long suffered from poverty, when a person who has long suffered from poverty, at last earns some wealth, then they are able to nourish their own body and their family, as well as engage in various long-desired activities that produce great pleasure for them. Similarly, when a bhakta is blessed by Sri Krishna with the long-desired wealth of prem, then they are able to engage their own body and senses in Krishna's service, and thereby experience the superlative bliss of pleasing Sri Krishna and relishing his madhurya. So as it was mentioned here in the Adi Lila, Panchama Purushartha se prema mahadhan, Krishna madhurya rasa karaya aswadan, prema hoite Krishna hoy nija bhakta vash, prema hoite pai Krishna seva sukaras. The fifth Purushartha, prema, the supreme wealth, causes relish of the rasa of Krishna's madhurya. By prema, Krishna becomes captivated by his own bhakta. By prema, we attain the rasa of the bliss of Krishna's service. A poor person, moreover, who earns money for the sake of alleviating their suffering and experiencing pleasure, may exhibit honorable qualities such as tolerance and diligence in the course of doing so, but thereby exhibits no spiritual meritoriousness if their aim has no objective beyond themselves or a limited immediate circle of persons or objects which they regard as their own, to the exclusion of nearly the entirety of the rest of the world, along with Bhagavan and all else otherworldly as well. So there's no doubt that many people facing very difficult circumstances in life exhibit many virtues and go to great degrees of effort and show great degrees of diligence and tolerance and perseverance and hard work and intelligence and so on in order to make money or in order to get what they want, in order, to achieve what is called svarta siddhi, or, the attainment of whatever objectives they have. So that in and of itself, if we analyze it through a filter of the degree of the effort that they made, the qualities that they exhibit, we might say this is very praiseworthy. This person has done a great job. This person has exhibited great qualities, has shown great intelligence. That's all fine. But from a spiritual perspective, whether all of that effort that they went to will result in any ultimate spiritual fulfillment or spiritual destiny, in majority of cases, the answer is no, because of the mentality and the aims that the person has. In other words, they're seeking their own happiness, excluding and being irreverent of the happiness of everyone else. They're saying, I'm existing in this whole, but I want to carve out a bit of it and have it for me, or some very limited circle of what I call my. Maybe it's my family, or maybe it's just my dog, or maybe it's my country, but not your country, or whatever the case may be, all these limited spheres of self-interest. So what creates the notion of spiritual merit from a zoomed out perspective is how inclusive our ideal of fulfillment is of others. In other words, do we seek a form of fulfillment that is achieved at the expense of others? Or maybe a little better is not at the expense, but to the exclusion of others. And how many others? Literally everyone? In other words, I just want to enjoy eating some food right now and I could care less where it came from or what it took to make it or what the consequences of me consuming this are. I just utterly don't care about anything except my own sensory experience right now. This type of absorption in a very, very localized object, this is, the epitome of worldly life. Whereas the other extreme is to say that the entirety of not only the visible world, but also what lies beyond the visible world, or this world and the next, the perceptible and the imperceptible, to have a conception of the totality of reality, or an infinite that's all-pervasive, all-encompassing of everything in existence, and to conceive of one's life, to conceive of meaning, to conceive of fulfillment, to conceive of satisfaction in a non-exclusive manner, or in other words, to conceive of it including the well-being and interest, and to seek satisfaction in a way that doesn't result in the detriment or the disenfranchisement or the exclusion of others who have the very same fundamental needs and interests that I do. This becomes something meritorious. This becomes something worthy of being valued as an ideal. So from the Gaudiya Vaishnava theological perspective, where Brahman is this all-pervading, all-encompassing aspect of the ultimate reality, which is understood to have its seat, if you will, or its non-different coexistence as Bhagavan, and this Bhagavan is understood to have many self-manifestations, and ultimately Bhagavan Sri Krishna, the dancer on the banks of the Yamuna, the relisher of the greatest richness of prema, when he's conceived from this ontologically integrating manner, and he's aspired, or rather service to him, his pleasure is aspired for as one's ideal, and one lives their life even in the physical space, even in the world, in the practical sense, in a way that is towards that ideal and not to the detriment of anyone else's pursuit of it, so far as is practically feasible, this will be a noble life, or the life of a Vaishnava. And thus a Vaishnava is known to be tolerant like a tree, is known to be humble like a blade of grass, is known to be respectful to everyone, irrespective of their race, of their gender, of their level of education, of their viewpoints, be they social, political, financial, religious, theological. Irrespective of all of this, the Vaishnava understands the inherent respectability of every entity in existence, and all the more the special respectability of those who are observing the spiritual path, of those who are actively cultivating these type of spiritual ideals. And they understand that to genuinely seek that higher experience, to genuinely seek to please Bhagavan, one cannot deny the presence of Bhagavan within every other entity that one shares the reality with, if you will. Natvevaham jatu nasham natam nime janadipa, as Krishna says in the beginning of the Gita. Never was there a time that I, nor you, nor all of these kings did not exist, and never in the future shall any of us cease to be. Here we are, all of us, together forever. So we can't exclude anybody, we can't erase anybody, we can't negate anybody. We have to see that which is most profoundly fulfilling is always inclusive and integrative of all others whose existence is, immutable. And that thus, to see the presence, to bear consciously in mind and in heart the presence of Bhagavan within every entity, especially within every human being, and thus to treat everyone with due care and respect as is appropriate according to context, is very central to the spirit of Vaishnavism. And if someone can imbibe these principles, as we discussed at length regarding the Trinadapi Sunicena verse, then what does Mahaprabhu call that? That's called the means by which one can chant the name that gives rise to prem. The implication being, you can chant all you like, but until you chant like this, don't expect to experience this thing called prem. In other words, the manner in which one goes about chanting is essential to the chanting resulting in the experience of prem. So that manner of chanting implies this manner of vision, this manner of sensitivity, this manner of respectfulness, and so forth. So persons who neglect all of these ideals and seek to simply experience desirable particular objects or vishoy to the exclusion and irreverence of all else, this is, darkness. This is looking down backwards, so to speak. So what we're getting to here is this idea that people may have many qualities in the conventional sense in the pursuit of that, but there's no spiritual merit in living that way. So the purity or the beauty of the Vaishnava and these Vaishnava ideals is that conversely, a bhakta who longs for prema, prays to Krishna to be engaged in his service, receives that opportunity, renders such service, and ultimately becomes blessed with prema for Krishna and highly rejoices, thereby exhibits the highest spiritual meritoriousness and bears no tinge of self-centeredness or separatism. In other words, to pursue happiness is not a fault. That's just the way the psyche is built. But to pursue it separately, to conceive of an artificial separation between one's own happiness and Bhagavan's happiness, or one's own happiness and the other's happiness, to do so self-centeredly to the exclusion and detriment of others, this is the fault. But the Vaishnava who makes Krishna's happiness their happiness, when their ideal is simply to please Krishna, and one understands that can only please Krishna by being kind and respectful to everyone, then their pursuit of happiness will never result in that which is detrimental to the well-being of another. So it's harmonizing, or it's capable of being successfully integrated and propagated or scaled out, so to speak. In theory, at least. Obviously, scale can create complications which have to be carefully navigated. But this is because prema, which is the aim they pursue and the reward they receive, is not like the wealth and enjoyment or artha and kama of the world. It is rather an aim and reward that is focused on Sri Krishna's pleasure and produces as much, if not more pleasure, for its bestower Sri Krishna as it does for the bhakta whom Sri Krishna blesses with it. So, Atmendriya priti cha dhare bolikam, Krishnendriya priti vancha dhare premanam, kamera tatparya nijasam bhoga keval, Krishna sukha tatparya hoy premato prabal. The desire to please one's own senses, that we call kama, and the desire to please Krishna's senses bears the name prema. The intention in kama is only one's own enjoyment. Prema, that the intention of which is Krishna's happiness, is certainly great. So kama and prema are sometimes synonymous, depending on the literature you're reading or the context the words are used, but here they're defined as opposites. And the distinction between them is made not necessarily in the activities that are involved in the pursuit of them, but rather in the intent or the desire with which those actions are performed. So when one's action is performed for the pleasure of Krishna, then it can be called an act of prema, when one's desire is to please Krishna. But that very same act, if it's performed to please one's own senses, is called kama. So, the contrast is there in the Bhagavatam between Kubja and the Brajagopis. They're described to, in some extent, do some of similar types of service or interact with Krishna in a similar way. But Kubja did it to please her own senses. The gopis did it to please Krishna's senses. So one is categorized as kama, one is categorized as prema. And here the distinction is made. The intention in kama is when one seeks one's own enjoyment, and if the other person also enjoys, no problem, no objection. But it's my enjoyment which is central. When the balance is like that, or the accent, if you will, is on my enjoyment in the exchange, then it's called kama. Whereas in the case of prema, the intention is upon Krishna's happiness. So I might also feel happy, but the accent, the emphasis, the deciding element is that I see that Krishna is happy. In other words, in the case of the prema bhakta who has such an attitude. And in the course of pleasing Krishna, if some happiness also comes to them, no objection. So bhaktas in this way undoubtedly experience profound pleasure in being blessed with prema and thereby acquiring the chance to personally serve Sri Krishna and relish his sweetness. In the course of this, the drive in the psyche of every embodied being to seek happiness and avoid suffering is undoubtedly also influential in the desires and actions of a bhakta. But because a bhakta, by virtue of the prema they have received, effectively fuses their own experience of happiness and the psyche's drive for it with Krishna's happiness, that is, because a bhakta attunes their psyche such that their happiness arises only from Krishna's happiness and not independently of that, A bhakta's happiness is free from the faults of self-centeredness or separatism. I think that needs an and is experienced by them as a naturally non-specifically sought out concomitant of their absorption in prema. Thus, the happiness they experience and the influence of the psyche's drive for happiness result in no demerit. So, for the mind's tendency to act, to influence one's thoughts, such that one pursues happiness, such that one seeks to avoid suffering, this is not good or bad. This is just how it works. But what you pin that drive towards, in other words, what you categorize cognitively as the means to happiness and the means to suffering, or the things to be accepted and the things to be rejected, that's where the consequences of one's actions get determined. In other words, what that very drive can function in the mind of a bhakta and function in sync with or churn under the influence of prema, such that with that drive one is producing greater and greater satisfaction for Krishna and thereby for everything, for everyone. And with that very same drive one can also, head straight to hell, so to speak, or, go about pursuing one's own pleasure at the expense and to the pain and suffering of others, such that one, causes great disturbance and ultimately causes great suffering for oneself and others. So that pursuit of pleasure and this attempt to avoid suffering is not necessarily to be categorized as right or wrong or faulty or not faulty, but how it's directed and the values that one attributes to elements within the animation, so to speak, are how one's destiny unfolds. So, finally, now, having made this whole point, the whole analogy here was about that prema is like wealth, so he's praying for this wealth of prema. So again, this prema is this desire to please Krishna, it's this desire, it's this love in which Krishna's happiness is central to the focus and the motivation of the bhakta. And it's that type of prema that is profoundly pleasing to Krishna, and it's persons with that type of prema that he keeps in his personal company, that he most relishes to be around, actually, who he can't live without. Right? He doesn't even want any of his own powers, he doesn't even want his own body, he doesn't even want anything if it wasn't for the company of those bhaktas. He lives for that exchange. He's also tad bhakta bhaktiman. He's also a bhakta of his bhaktas. He also has that same bhav towards them. So it's this perpetual exchange where one has made the happiness of the other central, and then the two are interacting with each other in that spirit that creates the greatest richness of exchange, and such that becomes the norm, that becomes the baseline, so to speak, or the meter, or the rhythm at which everything is moving in sync to. And that is, in essence, you could say, divine experience, or something that is valued and understood to be supremely fulfilling in and of itself, and worthy of being pursued as, a most noble, eternal quality of life. So, having made all these points, and thus understanding why prema is thus wealth, why it's the most central thing that's considered the means and essence of how one will find fulfillment, having made all that point, then the last thing that we're touching on now in the verse is that in this prayer where Mahaprabhu is saying, when as I call your name will I experience tears and trembling and so on, then as we discussed, those sattvika bhavas are indicators of a prayer for prema. So he's saying, when will I have prema as I call your name? So he's praying for prema to whom? He's praying to Krishna, as per the previous verse, and the earlier verses in the Shikshastakam, they're all addressed to Krishna. So this is a subject which is dealt with, in particular, Acharya Radha Govindanath in his analysis of the Charitamrita gives a big discussion on this topic. I've kind of picked out a few of the essential points from it. But the point is brought up, why is Mahaprabhu praying to Krishna for prema? In other words, he's not praying to a guru, he's not praying to a Vaishnava, he's praying to Krishna specifically. So that point will be discussed now, that the significance of the recipient of the prayer. So finally, it is also to be noted that in the verse under discussion, and the payar expressive of its purport by Sri Kaviraj Goswami Pad, Sriman Mahaprabhu's prayer for prema is addressed to Sri Krishna, and not to a guru, Vaishnava, or other figure. This is because it is ultimately only Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself who bestows prema upon bhaktas. Although this in many cases occurs when he is appealed to by another bhakta, be it a sadhaka's guru or another bhakta, to bestow prema upon a humble and deeply longing aspirant. Sri Rupa Pad indicates this in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu with reference to the Bhagavatam 5.6.18, as does Sri Jiva Pad in Priti Sandarbha. So ontologically there, Jiva Goswami gives this analysis, saying that it's only Bhagavan's own Sarup Shakti that he casts beginninglessly and continuously into his Nitya Parikaras that enables them to be imbued with prema. So it's Bhagavan's own Shakti, Bhagavan's own potency that he's allowing as the Shaktiman, as the possessor of the Shakti, for it to flow into others. So from an ontological perspective, as well as from a descriptive perspective in the Bhagavatam, we get this idea that it's ultimately Krishna who grants prema. And that doesn't mean you don't need a guru, that doesn't mean you don't benefit from serving Vaishnavas or receiving the blessings of Vaishnavas. You certainly do. And you certainly need those things. But that those are instrumental elements, and that from you could say an ontological perspective, there's also this necessity of it being granted by Krishna. So we see evidence of this also at the conclusion of the Govinda Lilamrita in a very charming verse that Kaviraj Goswami ends the text with, one of the very final statements where he gives a final prayer for the benefit of his readers, saying, Sri Kaviraj Goswami Pad also indicates this at the conclusion of his Govinda Lilamrita, in a prayer that serves as a blessing upon the readers of the text. So, yere tat paripiyate hridilasat trishnatire kanmuhur brahmadhyarapi durgamam vrajavidor lilamritam radhaya vrindaranya vilasini kumudini vrindasya bandhur vraje karunyadachirena vanchitatamam tesham tanutu swayam. May the friend of the lilies, of the charming women in the forest of Brinda in Braja, that is, the moon-like Sri Krishna, the beloved of the lily-like gopis, out of compassion, personally and without delay, bestow that which is most desired, namely prema seva, upon those by whom this Lilamrita, meaning this Govinda Lilamrita, as well as the nectar of the Lila described in it, of himself the moon of Braja with Radha, is continuously imbibed in full, out of an abundance of thirst, rollicking in the heart, although such Lilamrita is inaccessible even to Brahma and others. So if we jump into discussion of that verse, we won't have time for anything else, so we'll have to let that be. But the key point here, referent to the citation, is where it ends with this phrase, tanutu svayam, where Kaviraj Goswami is saying, may he grant this himself. So, from a theological perspective, it's interesting, so to speak, that Kaviraj Goswami makes this pointed matter of emphasis at the conclusion of this work, that it's evoking Krishna as the ultimate bestower of prema upon the bhakta. So, these, in other words, Kaviraj Goswami, Rupa Goswami, Jiva Goswami, others, other evidences are also there. I'm just giving a few to show that it's ultimately the Ishta Devata of the Bhakta, Bhagavan Sri Krishna, who grants this cherished aim of the path, Prema Bhakti, to the aspirant. And it's that very Krishna who came in the form of the Shastra, who came in the form of the Guru, who came in the form of the Shraddha in the heart, and so forth. It's ultimately he who's self-manifesting himself through all of these means. Jiva Goswami has that beautiful verse at the end of the Bhakti Sandarbha. Guru Shastram Shraddha Ruchiranugatir Siddhiriti Me Yare Tat Tatsarvam Charana Kamalayo Rajatiyayo Kripa Madvi Kena Snapita Nayanaṁ Bhojayugalo Sadaradha Krishna Asharana Gatido Tam Ratiriti Me. I think maybe I'm missing a word there. But where he's saying it's Radha and Krishna who are the givers of shelter to the shelterless. And from them come the Guru, the Shastra, the Shraddha, the Seva, and ultimately the Siddhi, etc. So this one tattva expressing itself in all these different ways to ultimately bestow this most wonderful state of being known as prema, whereby that entity can then interact with the finest essence of that one tattva in the most rich and profound and intimate way. This is, the spirit of the Gaudiya Darshan, if you will. So, furthermore, it is specifically the Sri Krishna of Brajadam, spoken of in this blessing from the conclusion of Govinda Lilamrita, that Sriman Mahaprabhu prays to in the verse under discussion. Since it is only this Krishna, Swayam Bhagavan Sri Krishna, the Prince of Braja, who grants the superlative prema found only in his most confidential and wonderful abode, that is, his personal abode of Braja. So, in gist, Ainanda Tanuja Kinkaram, the previous verse, Mahaprabhu appealed specifically to the son of Nanda, meaning the Krishna of Braja. So the implication is that the following statement, when he says, Tava nāma grahaṇe bhaviṣyati, as I call your name, that he's also praying specifically to the Krishna of Braja. So the implication further is that the prema that he's aspiring for, represented by the sattvika bhavas that he describes in the verse, is the prema found specifically in the land of Braja. So, in that way, we can understand what is implied by his prayer here in the 6th verse. So, that'll conclude our discussion of this verse, and in our next reading, we'll just start fresh. From this point on, I begin the introduction to the 4th verse of the Shikshastakam, which will be the 6th verse of the Shikshastakam that we've gotten to so far here in the Padyavali. The last two are the 7th and 8th verse, and they come much later near the end of Padyavali, but this will be the 6th of the 8 verses that we've covered so far. So I conclude here. If anyone has comments, questions, corrections, or other feedback, feel free. Yes, Vidiji.
Jai Radhe.
Jai Shri Radhe.
Jai Sri Rupa Gosvami. Jai to you. Pranam.
Pranam.
I've been around quite some time, and I hear constant encouragement or description of glories of prema, glories of bhakti, glories of bhaktas, glories of exchanges. You hear glories, and I was wondering, what's the hope? Because the question comes from the fact that when Mahaprabhu was here, and maybe after him, he left, the bhakti, Raghunaga Bhakti, was available in a sense of Premi Bhaktas around who could just basically share the gift or share prema with others, and there are records to that. Well, I give example of Mahaprabhu that he indiscriminately he gave prema, right, to random devotees, and also he has. The point is that. Oh yeah. So at one point he was giving. Actually, my question is more like regarding what actually is diksha, because we don't have example of Mahaprabhu giving diksha to anybody, but he had discussions with Bhaktas, great Vaishnavas, and through that discussion, through that influence or charge or transference of his energy, pranic energy, they have absorbed that. So basically, there's not much, like we don't know for sure. Like you see that Mahaprabhu acknowledged Rupa Gosvami is the one that accepted he understood everything. So understood means that he absorbed, he got it. Yet we don't have evidence of him initiating Mahaprabhu. So and also so what I'm saying is that the Raganuga Bhakti is being distributed, where it was distributed just by influence of Pari Bhakta. There's no Pancharatrika Diksha in per se, in my understanding. And so now we have Pancharatrika Diksha, we have Sampradaya, we have Parampara, yet it's really, like, you've done lots of research everywhere, but there is no, really, we don't have Premi Bhaktas. You can't even dare to say that. But from my, skewed perception, I just see this is the same reality as it was during Mahaprabhu and after post-Mahaprabhu time, hundreds of years after that Raghunaga Bhakti was shared and distributed. And so my question is to address this. What's the hope for us, being so remote, being so distant from actual this scenario that was prevalent for for centuries? And first century after Mahaprabhu, first 100 years after Mahaprabhu, and 200 years of Mahaprabhu, 300 years of Mahaprabhu. We have examples of wonderful biographies of wonderful Siddha Bhaktas and how they obtained and how they evolved. And I know that right now, the message has been distributed far and wide and to people who are not qualified at all for it. But still, we are interested. We want to get prema, but what's the hope if we don't have that actual person that will transfer this prema to us? We have Shastra, we have devotees around, we have guidance, but that core association is missing. And I was wondering if you can, besides giving a pep talk, okay, everything's okay, and you'll just be patient, and be positive. Besides, if you just can elaborate or maybe just hint how this scenario will permit random people like from the West worldwide to obtain any prema, basically prema.
Well, I mean, you mentioned a lot of things there. I don't know
I know
if
it's loaded. I know. It's quite loaded. But maybe I would like to start some conversation. Maybe that I may bring up later on. But if you just can start off, just whatever inspire you to address this. Thank you.
Well, I'll just say that when prema is something so blessed and so beautiful and so fulfilling in any magnitude, and even in its absence, even it just becoming acquainted with it as an ideal and becoming acquainted with the beautiful interactions and expressions that it gave rise to in those whose hearts it filled. That's a blessed life, and and that's itself is a very great fortune. If I think about what my outlook on the world was before I heard of such a thing, and I think about how it changed my outlook on the world, I find that a profound benefit. And when I, see, just if you look at the news and you look at what people are doing who don't know about this, or who haven't had the association to learn to cherish this, then, really there's a black and white distinction in the quality of life that people live, and the level of, goodness or harm that their actions can create. So while it may seem that much of what is described in Gaudiya Vaishnava literature and in the, lore, if you will, of the Sampradaya over the recent centuries, even if in the midst of the technological and social changes that have come about, especially in the last century, seem to have, changed the social fabric such that that same kind of ferventness of bhakti that we hear about and that is, sort of enshrined in some of this hagiographical literature and so on, doesn't seem to be so prevalent, or seems hard to find, or we may not have ever come across it in our personal life and experience with people we've met. Then if we value the ideal, then just to have awareness of the ideal and the opportunity to pursue it from wherever we actually are, which is in this time and space now, is really something to be profoundly grateful for, and can lead to a deep degree of feeling and humility and prayer, like the prayer that we're hearing about in this section and elsewhere in the Padyavali. So, that we, Narottam Thakur lamented that he wasn't born earlier. So if Thakur Mahashai is saying, oh, it seems like I came late, and then people after Thakur Mahashai are saying, oh, I didn't get to meet Thakur Mahashai, and then the next generation, oh, I didn't get to meet these Mahatmas of Braj of the 16th century. Oh, I didn't get to meet these great Siddha Mahatmas of the 19th century. Everybody, I think, feels some degree of that want for, seeking what has been praised and have said to have happened in the past. And I'm inclined to think that in all likelihood, any such, manifestations of divine love, so to speak, are quite a rare thing, and when we read these biographies or we read some of the literature, it can sort of become as if something common, but in reality, it's kind of like a highlight reel of a huge span of time boiled down into a few pages. So it can seem like maybe someone's life was all the time exciting with this and that, but the actual experience of it might not have been quite as exciting or quite as pervaded by so many things as it can be perceived in hindsight. So, on the one hand, we want to cherish that literature and be inspired by it. But on the other hand, the purpose of that literature is not to just leave us discouraged and feeling like we missed out. That's not how the authors and the people described in that literature would want us to feel. So they would want us to feel, encouraged and inspired to pursue this beautiful path, given the challenges of today. And another thing is that I'm also inclined to think that the you could say the cultural symbology of sainthood or divinity can also change with time. And maybe just because people today aren't Siddha Mahatmas according to the definition of previous centuries, I'm also open to the idea that maybe that's okay, and that maybe the way that bhakti and the way that these things can be expressed in the society and the time and place and the unfolding of eternity that we're in right here, right now, might be different, and that we don't necessarily have to have like an inferiority complex about that. I'm not implying that you do. I'm just saying that that sort of like, oh, we're all just lost in the Kali Yuga, or we're all just a victim of today's society, and therefore there's nothing to do. It's like, our karma, our destiny, the grace of Bhagavan, all these factors, everything has blended to bring us right here to this moment, right here, right now, to have a new experience and do something beautiful and progressive, which is in the spirit of the tradition that we live in, the teachings that we've received, but necessarily will also need to have some novel degree of expression because it's in a new context. And so, to live in the spirit of the teachings and to try to, according to the, stature that we're at, we may not have the level of, vairagya or purity or things that many of these Mahatmas had, but from wherever we are in whatever situation, to make a progressive attempt to live out these ideals. That to me is the perfection of one's life, and maybe that'll win you a spot in the literature as a famous saint, or maybe you'll just evaporate into never having been heard of by anyone ever, and disappear into the eons of eternity. So what? Everything has its meaning in our relationship with Bhagavan, irrespective of how things might look to society, or how stories might be told about it in the present or in the future.
Right. And then the part that you mentioned, that that ultimately the Krishna's blessings and Krishna's application with bhakta is that's what's important. We don't, of course, we do not discredit any other item or dependencies, like we depend on Vaishnava's mercy and stuff. But ultimately, there is a factor, as you mentioned, that Krishna is the blesser, the mula, kripar in Kripalu. Right? He's the one who gives actually mercy. And regardless of circumstances we are in, our main motto or objective or action in our consciousness should be depending completely on Him, regardless of whatever situation it may be, a relationship may be. That ultimately He will take us through all the difficulties, lifetimes, and guide us, basically. The only thing is that there's a fear related to this, because just like you are totally immersed in Shastra, and not everybody has this facility. So people just need to rely on partly sentimental, emotional, partly scriptural Shraddha. So, and I was just wondering if Krishna is the one that will actually, regardless of all circumstances, he's the one that actually responds to Bhaktas, or whatever neophyte person is there, praying for his kripa and trying to honestly, sincerely obtain his mercy, despite of circumstances, like completely conditioned to living in the hell almost. Yeah. Jai Shri Krishna.
Jai Ho, Jai Ho.
Thank you. It's a very nice presentation.
Thank you. All right, I could go. I think, did you want to say something? I have to sign off soon, but I have a brief little bit more time.
I just wanted to, you mentioned towards the end that Krishna is the ultimate giver of prema, ontologically speaking. I just need some clarification. What is Bhakti Devi's role? I understand she's the Antaranga Shakti of Bhagwan, and therefore, whatever she says, Bhagwan will do. But just the part where Bhakti's independent, where does that fit in here? If Krishna is the ultimate giver of prema?
When you say bhakti is independent, what is the context of that independence?
Well, then, she can give bhakti, so she can give bhakti to whomever she desires. Is that correct?
I mean, I can't think of any verse that, to that effect precisely. There are definitely statements where bhakti is praised as a devi, and but at the same time, it's not exactly like there's a devi of bhakti sort of, who's not Radharani, or who's not a gopi, or who's not Lakshmi, or, we don't hear exactly about a bhakti devi as, a person who's taking an active personified role in things. So, for the most part, I think the idea is that bhakti is a shakti that belongs to Bhagavan, and so bhakti is that which flows according to Bhagavan's wish, or as a shakti, as someone at his disposal, so to speak, for his service. Then where he sends bhakti, there it shall dwell, so to speak. And Bhagavan casts this bhakti, as Jiva Gosvami describes it, into his bhaktas, and then, as he described and as we discussed earlier in the Charitamrita about sadhu sangha, then those bhaktas can bless people, and wish that they also receive bhakti, and by the blessings of sadhus, those people come to receive bhakti. So I don't really see so much discussion of bhakti being like a third party to all of that, separate from Bhagavan and separate from bhaktas who makes decisions about all of this. I can't say that I recall any statements to that effect. So when we think of bhakti as being independent, usually that is contextualized in the sense of not something that emerges as a consequence of karma, not something that can be achieved by means of gyan, something that is independent of the conventional cycle of cause and effect, and something that's experienced and felt only by grace. And as we discussed that commentary of Chakravarti Pad, that bhakti inspires the bhakta to bestow bhakti, or to grant a blessing for someone else to receive bhakti. So in that sense, you could say that bhakti is causing itself or acting independently. But as far as I understand, that's primarily in a figurative sense, in that when a bhakta has bhakti, then the disposition that they have by the virtue of having that bhakti is that they're compassionate, they're kind to people, and they wish others to have the state of blessedness and goodness that they experience by virtue of bhakti, and thus they wish that others can have the experience of bhakti as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, I'll conclude here, if I may. And if we're so blessed, then we'll continue in our next reading with the next verse of the Shikshastakam. So, Vaishnavibhyo Namo Nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.